thanks again to David for organising the colloquium. I'm sorry I haven't been here for most of today. As His Grace mentioned, we had our sixth child last Tuesday, not Tuesday this week, previous week. And prior to that, we sold a house, moved home, in the middle of building a house at the moment. So it's been a bit frantic in my space over the last few months. So I was trying to get this paper finished in time, which I think I managed to do. But I know the papers would have been very interesting and engaging. I'm looking forward to reading them and watching them from the recording. And I hope what I do today, what I present, ties in with some of the other themes that have been mentioned, and certainly His Grace's talk. Much of what I say will have a complementarity and overlapping with as we're kind of battling these issues on common grounds. Look, just to give some background, so part of my role with the Archbishop is fighting a lot of these causes that are causing so much disruption to our society. Over the last 8 years that I've worked for His Grace, the Archdiocese, we've had a number of battles, and it's become clear to me, fighting battle after battle, the kind of end game that the enemy is aiming at. And through that kind of practical reflection, and then my own study and trying to finish and submit a doctoral thesis, which ties into some of these themes, I've tried to put together some thoughts which hopefully will have some resonance on this topic of religious freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and how we might best go about really defending it, promoting it, and where to from here. So this gives you a bit of a context of where I'm coming from. It's not just a purely academic or intellectual perspective, but really from the battles that we've fought, and I'll try and allude to those time permitting. I've tried not to go much further than about 25 minutes, so hopefully I'll be pretty much dead on or maybe even a bit under. And I know it's the end of the day, so thank you for sticking around, and hopefully this won't put you to sleep. Okay, so increasingly, as a number of speakers would have been mentioning, and indeed in the background of the colloquium, we're witnessing governments placing limitations on what individuals can say, both in public but also in private, increasingly in private conversations, as it concerns fundamental beliefs about the nature and purpose of human existence. These limitations have been focused in particular on issues to do with human sex and gender identity and human sexuality. They involve the practical application of fundamentally important theological and metaphysical beliefs. That is, they're attacking, limiting the expression of that practical application and implication of fundamental theological and metaphysical beliefs. But also, and increasingly, statements of biological facts. For example, the claim that there are only two sexes, male and female. This kind of statement would in certain legal jurisdictions be viewed as discriminatory because it limits the discussion to sex and not gender. Yet it's based on a biblical belief in creation by God in the form of two distinct sexes or types of human beings, male and female, but also objective human biology. This move by governments is a result of fierce political lobbying and media campaigning by activist groups, commonly referred to under that umbrella of LGBTQI, over the last 40 years. Governments do not operate in a vacuum, as we know. They respond and try and speak to the dominant movements in the culture in order to appear relevant. The efforts by government to limit freedom of speech and expression in these areas can be understood, I believe, as a direct result of activist lobbying and campaigning, which has been incredibly effective. I think we can't deny that. More generally, these activist groups have sought to get any expression of views counter to their agenda cancelled by the media, educational and corporate entities. This phenomenon, referred to as cancel culture increasingly, is pervasive. it has effectively resulted in the silencing of anyone who holds an opposing position out of fear of being targeted either through social media or discrimination legislation. The response of Christians and others to this cancel culture has been to appeal to the right of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and to seek or to get better legal protections for these rights, particularly in Australia, where they have been poorly protected despite our signing of international covenants and agreements on human rights. And rightly so. There should be adequate protections for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, particularly when we see other traits are so heavily protected in law. But a critical question is how do we best go about this? All our attempts to date have been largely unsuccessful. And we've been going at this for a number of years. It's not just 2 or 3 years, it's 10, 15, 20 years. In this paper, I do not want to address the question of why we have been unsuccessful in itself. I think that's an important question, and some speakers may have looked into that today. There's complex reasons, and so that won't be the focus of my paper. But rather what I want to do is to consider maybe a different type of approach, an alternative strategy, and one that I think, or I'll argue at least, I think we need to take on in order to have real impact, not just in the short term but in the long term. And so I think a lot of our focus has been on, and certainly fighting those battles as I've done, it's always on the kind of the immediate context, trying to stop something now, trying to, how do we bring this to an end now? How do we to impede it? And we often lose sight on the longer, medium to long term vision. And so I think that's a bit of a problem of fighting so often so many different things, and particularly in the last few years, one after the other. So I want to try to propose an alternative approach, and one that I think may be a better way forward in general terms, not in specifics. So I won't try to drill down into exact detail. We hear so much of the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion in contemporary Western society, but what exactly do they mean, and how should Christians and those of goodwill understand these rights, and how do we then look at promoting them and defending them? In this paper, I want to argue that a fundamental problem with contemporary debate about freedom of speech and freedom of religion is a lack of agreement over exactly what we are arguing for. And this is not just pertaining to this debate. I think in a lot of our public debates now, we often find ourselves not able to actually agree on basic terms, which is it's a bit of a cultural problem. It's one that Alistair McIntyre and other philosophers have tried to address and explain, but the practical reality of that still isn't being addressed, I don't think, particularly in the media, but in our political debates in general. There are rival understandings of these freedoms and what their ultimate importance is. I want to try and show the difference today between what I believe is an authentically Catholic understanding, as that's my particular tradition, and the dominant liberal understanding. Recognising that there is a particular temptation on the part of Christians, and I blame myself in part too, or temptation that I myself feel, to employ a kind of liberal philosophical approach, political approach, in an attempt to appeal to principles and beliefs that the majority of our fellow citizens can understand and might find compelling. So this is the phenomenon where we have a particular belief in our tradition, and yet we know if we try to express it in those terms to others who don't share that tradition, they'll just look blankly at us. And so then we try and translate something of our tradition into the dominant terms in our culture to appeal to them. Now there is some merit in that to an extent, but I think possibly we've gone too far and we've not really thought carefully about some of the deficits in doing that. I want to suggest that Christians and those of goodwill must resist the liberal approach if they're going to have success at championing what is an authentic understanding of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I want to argue, following the Christian theological tradition, that the concept of freedom only has meaning in relation to the truth, as Archbishop Julian talked about in his presentation. These two, particularly freedom, only make sense in relation to the truth. Now, this for many of us here might sound particularly unexceptional, but unfortunately this is not the case for the vast majority of those in our society. Indeed, it is itself a cause for considerable concern. It is absolutely critical to understand that one can only genuinely defend freedom or liberty on the basis of a prior commitment to the objective truth. For it is only because of the truth that freedom itself is a possibility. Without the truth, there could only be the pursuit of desire and feelings and endless manipulation. A reality in truth so dark to even conceive of, it would be far beyond any Hollywood horror movie. Unless Christians move to return to speaking about freedom and rights fundamentally based in the pursuit of truth, in the commitment to truth, I believe we will ultimately be unsuccessful in getting genuine and lasting protections for the public expression and practice of Christianity, which itself has been essential to the development and major achievements of Western civilization. So, what is freedom, and what is a right understanding of freedom? The concept of freedom, as we know, is complex, and there's no attempt here in this paper to offer a full discussion. Rather, I want to focus on particular aspects of freedom, understanding of freedom, and two particular ways we might understand freedom, which I'm sure you're familiar with in some respect. First, we can understand freedom in terms of having the capacity in our nature for choice. In this sense, we can say that what makes human beings different to other creatures is that they are free. They have the capacity for choice, the capacity to make decisions. Indeed, it's a fundamental part of our nature that we have this self-awareness, this consciousness. We are confronted with choice at every point in our lives. Unlike animals who are purely directed by desire and instinct, we have freedom. We have to make conscious decisions as to how we're going to act. We have to actually make a decision. So in this sense, we can say that all human beings are free. They have a capacity for choice or decision making. We might call this an anthropological or existential dimension of freedom. It's an element of our nature, fundamental element of our nature. But it can be used, we can use this capacity well or poorly. Through the exercise of this capacity, we achieve flourishing of our nature, or we can impede that flourishing. That's the first sense in which we can talk about freedom. The second sense of the concept of freedom concerns a situation where outside limitations are placed on our capacity to choose, when we are restricted or prevented from acting in a way we would like to. In this situation, we use the term freedom in terms of liberation from some kind of oppression or force which limits us. For the Christian, then, we can speak of being free or being made with freedom, but also in terms of seeking freedom, specifically freedom from oppression and original sin in particular. But what we seek as Christians is not so much a state of perpetual freedom in the sense of endless choice, but one of full human flourishing or eternal blessedness. This can only be attained through divine grace, but at least for the Catholic tradition, requires us to make ourselves into the kind of persons we are called to be in Christ through our actions, through the choices we make. In this second sense of freedom, we can speak of at least two types of freedom: a freedom from and a freedom for. Typically, the most prominent understanding of freedom in our culture has been developed through the liberal philosophical political tradition. The core of this conception is the idea that freedom fundamentally involves a freedom from, as opposed to a freedom for. In other words, freedom is understood as an end in itself. Being free involves freedom from interference, freedom from the state. It puts a person in a state of freely choosing. More fundamentally, this understanding of freedom is premised on a particular conception of the person, a particular metaphysical anthropology, where the end of human life is viewed in terms of being freely choosing, the freely choosing self, as some liberal theorists have referred to it. It's not about what you choose, but simply that you are in a position to choose, free of external impediment. This is most clearly championed by those described as anti-perfectionist liberals. It's not about achieving some perfection, some state, it's just about choosing. I, of course, have vastly oversimplified the full complexity or nuance in what are some very sophisticated liberal theories, such as John Rawls and friends. But what is critical is that to be a liberal is by definition to hold that liberty, understood as an end in itself, is the most important political principle for human existence. The second understanding of freedom is of freedom for. In this case, freedom is more of an instrumental good. It's necessary and important because of what you need it for to achieve the good or the end, to make decisions necessary for flourishing according to our nature. This conception is premised on a different anthropology to the liberal one. We might refer to this as a kind of Aristotelian or perfectionist anthropology, where there is a fixed nature and we can develop or we can undermine that flourishing through our actions, how we use that freedom. The human rights tradition, which has come from the work of liberal theorists, champions an understanding of freedom in terms of freedom from. It asserts simply that human beings by nature have certain rights, primarily a right to self-preservation and a liberal understanding, and that we enter into society in order to better protect these original rights or freedoms, these powers. The role of government on this understanding is simply to protect the freedom of the individual, to structure society so there might be the maximum freedom compatible with at the same time maintaining civil order. In this approach, government is all about individual freedom. Contrary to this, as I argue more detail in my doctoral work, the Catholic tradition, while more recently coming to use the concepts of human rights, understands such rights in a radically different way to the liberal tradition. For the Catholic tradition, there are no primordial or original natural rights that adhere in human nature. Rather, there is fundamentally the eternal law, which contains the true ordering of all things. And our way of participating in the eternal law through either the divine law, which has been revealed through divine revelation, and the natural law, our way of participating through the use of human reason, faith and reason. So again, that aspect of what Archbishop Julian was talking about. These laws tell us what we are, what our purpose is, and how we flourish. The moral law, which we discern through reason working both in divine revelation and human experience and observation, tells us how we must act in order to be happy, to realise our full human flourishing. The role of government on this understanding is not primarily to protect individual freedom, rather it is to promote the common good of society, what is understood as the flourishing of all together. Moral rights such as human rights then, in this understanding, can only arise from the moral law and are only the subjective rendering of what is the objective moral law. The moral right arises from the prior moral principle. An example would be the protection of human life. The church doesn't teach there is some primordial thing in our nature, right in our nature, which holds I have a right to life. Rather, we start at the principle of do not kill. This can be rendered into a subjective expression. If you respect the moral law, then you should not kill. You go even further and say, I have the right to life. This is the way in which the church has approached this issue of rights. This, of course, is immensely complex, and again, I'm simplifying. There's many steps to get there, but for the purposes of time. However, what is critical for the Catholic approach is that human rights are not primordial. Rather, the moral law is primordial, and this is the law of human flourishing. The role of government is not fundamentally to protect human freedom. Rather, it's to promote the common good, to promote flourishing. This promotion of the common good, however, does involve the recognition of some fundamental goods which the government is obligated to protect, such as life, such as marriage. There are moral absolutes, and government only exercises rightful authority when they respect the moral law and these fundamental goods. So the Catholic approach to the question of freedom in society must primarily be not about the individual and their human rights, but about the truth and the role and the rightful role and authority of government. The truth of the human person and the rightful role and authority of the government. When the Church speaks of the right to religious freedom, it would do better and be more accurate, that is more consistent with its own understanding, to speak firstly explicitly about the obligation to truth, or indeed the desire in our nature to know the truth. Now, it does in fact do this in the Second Vatican Council document on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae. So I'm not trying to tell the Church something that it's not. It is doing it. But the problem is when we hear the right to religious freedom as a concept, as a term, we don't get that full understanding of what is prior to that. And that's in part the difficulty of using rights language in general. It can be very assertive and lacking context. In Dignitatis Humanae, it makes very clear that any proper notion of a right to religious freedom can only be grounded in the truth and in the obligation to know the truth. But unfortunately, this document, and indeed this teaching, has been little understood even amongst the Catholic community. The human person is radically defined by their capacity for God. That is, they have been made for relationship with God. As St. Augustine said, the heart is restless until it rests in God. Government of society has as one of its fundamental tasks on this understanding the promotion and protection of the human quest to know the truth, ultimately to know God. But just as important to recognise is that government is not the source of truth or the rightful authority to reveal and safeguard the truth. This is the role, as a Catholic I understand, as the role of the Church. But governments must be, or at least seek to be, the servants of the truth. And this again is where I think we haven't been as strong in proclaiming, in teaching and advocating. Indeed, it is only in this recognition that governments are not the source of truth, that they are in fact, or should be understood to be the servants of truth. In this radical limitation, that human government can remain authentic to itself, can remain what it is. It might seem a bit paradoxical, but for it's only through recognising that government is not divine, that it's rather the servant of truth, that it's not the source of truth, that it can be a form of authentically human government and not become simply a competitor religion. Government does not, by its own authority, grant rights as such, at least moral rights. Rather, in establishing legal protections for religion, for the practice of religion, for freedom of speech, They are operating as servants of the truth. They are simply acknowledging what they must. In order for human governments to remain authentically human, they must recognise this. Unfortunately, over the last 40 or 50 years, Christians have stopped saying this effectively and stopped talking about the truth in politics, again, in part because we want to be effective, I think. And talk of truth in politics doesn't seem to get us very far. We have fallen for the liberal trap in this way of trying to adapt ourselves to the culture, which itself was built on this liberal fiction of government being neutral. That government simply is a matter of procedures and structures which govern and maintain order that don't rely on controversial theological or metaphysical beliefs. That government must remain silent on matters of truth, lest it create conflict between those with rival beliefs. The fiction of government neutrality is yet to be fully exposed in practice, although I believe in theory this has been shown quite clearly by a number of theorists, in particular Alistair McIntyre. Those in government cannot be neutral on questions of the nature and purpose of human existence. One can only approach questions of human governance on the basis of some commitment to a particular conception of the person. And ultimately, as a Catholic, I would say one can only be for or against Christ. There is no fence sitting in terms of how we approach questions of the political order, which ultimately are questions of the human person. So what does all this mean? I believe it means we must radically change the way in which we as Christians and those of goodwill engage and express our beliefs in our political engagement, and indeed in the way we teach about the practical implications, particularly of the Christian faith. For Catholics, it's little understood that, again, the Second Vatican document, Untitled Chapter, did not reject the prior so-called traditional understanding of the nature of the relationship between faith and politics, which proclaimed and sought to fully embody the social reign of Christ, as taught in the tradition, and more explicitly in the writings of the popes, Pius XI in Quas Primas, particular example. Put simply, this teaching holds that human society cannot flourish without embracing the way of Christ. In other words, without Christ, what is fully human cannot be attained. For it's only through Christ that the human being, the human person, makes sense and can be understood. As Dignitatis Humanae states, it leaves untouched the traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies to the true religion and toward the one Church of Christ. So, in fact, despite what many may have heard as a dominant narrative, the Catholic Church did not become the champion of a liberal conception of freedom and democracy and rights. No, I believe that what it actually did in these documents is that it tried to express its traditional approach to the question of faith and politics in a way that might better be understood by the world, a genuine attempt in that regard to use the language of rights. However, unfortunately, unintentionally, it seems to have created more confusion. Now, again, the exact details of how I cannot go into here, but again, it's part of the doctoral work I'm doing. But I think that's pretty clear that there is a lack of understanding, particularly in the Catholic community, on this point. Rather than speak of the need to properly protect religious freedom in itself, I believe we need to speak more about the government's proper role as one of serving the truth, and not as the final source of truth, the final authority of truth. That government is itself limited in its authority and acts outside this authority when it seeks to allow the suppression of truth. We need to speak of the obligation we all have to know the truth. It is clear that the notion of objective truth, that there is an objective moral order, has also been under siege for the last 40 to 50 years. So much so now that even the notion of there being a fixed biological reality for human beings is being rejected. Already those who state that only biological women are real women or that biological men are real men are being prosecuted through various so-called anti-discrimination laws. Similarly, those who state that marriage can only be between a biological man and a biological woman. At the moment, the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute has released a final report on so-called conversion therapy laws, in which it advocates classifying statements of biological reality as forms of hate speech under the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act. The reality warned about by St. John Paul II, I believe, is coming to pass. He said in Sanctissimus Annus, "In a world without truth, freedom loses its foundation, and people are exposed to the violence of passion and to manipulation, both open and hidden." Christians, the churches, and indeed all men and women of goodwill must stand up and defend the objective truth, the existence of truth. We know that totalitarian governments become possible when people lose sight of the truth. As G.K. Chesterton said, when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't then believe in nothing, he believes anything. The eclipse of truth in our society, in particular now biological truth, presents an existential threat to our society. The full consequences of this loss of truth are only evident once it is gone, and by then it's too late to stop the horrors of what will shortly follow. People forget too easily that the pagan world from which Christianity saved Western civilization was not a very nice place to live. It did not treat women and children very well at all, or indeed any non-citizens. It is of course no surprise that we are seeing a return to pagan belief more and more publicly in arts festivals like Dark Mofo, an attempt to bring back pagan rituals as a kind of light-hearted playfulness, not realising the darkness that it is unleashing. The difficulty with the liberal concept of religious freedom is that while it began as a form of Christian tolerance made into a formal principle, it has now become, in principle, a commitment to protect any kind of belief about the purpose of human existence, no matter how dark or destructive. A recent example of this was highlighted by The Australian back in January of 2021, when the so-called Temple of Satan was given recognition by the Sunshine Coast University Hospital Multi-Faith Centre as a religion alongside Christianity, Islam and Judaism worthy of protection. However, from a Christian perspective, there is no obligation for government to give special recognition and protection to movements that by their nature are opposed to objective truth, or more fully put, opposed to truth, beauty and goodness, the transcendentals which have already been raised here today. While it can sometimes be difficult to make a call in judgment as to when a belief system has moved from that position of truth, of affirming truth, of defending truth, goodness and beauty, this, I believe, the Temple of Satan is a clear example where the line needs to be drawn. But again, following the liberal approach, it isn't and it won't. The government has a legitimate responsibility in protecting individuals from beliefs that directly attack basic human goods and the very notion of objective truth itself. Commitment to religious freedom itself cannot and does not capture this deeper reality as to what is at stake. We must go deeper. We must return to the explicit proclamation and defence of the truth. So, in conclusion, just make a few comments. The fight to get adequate legal protections for the public expression of religious belief is fundamentally important. Absolutely. We need to push as hard as we can for this. We're now fighting even for the basic protections to express biological facts. So the ground is quickly moving. However, as I have argued, I believe the approach we have been taking has ultimately potentially been undermining our own cause. We will never be able to properly protect the expression of religious belief, or indeed the expression of biological reality, which goes against the dominant values in the culture, unless more broadly we explicitly and publicly defend the truth and assert the importance of the recognition of the objective truth for our society and governance of the society. It is the loss of a sense and understanding of objective truth that I believe has led us into this current situation. Again, a big point to make, but I think it's fairly easy to show if I had a bit more time, perhaps. The only way forward is to once again become public defenders of the truth, which itself restores human government to its authentic self and stops it becoming a tyrannical pagan faith, directed by nothing more than arbitrary human desire. Let us be clear. I believe we are facing nothing less than an all-out fight for the defence of the great achievements of Western civilization. It is time for Christianity and those of goodwill to return to a full proclamation of the truth, freed from the distortions of philosophical liberalism. And I think I'll leave it at that.